Baylor University's Institute for Study of Religion released what they believe is the most scientific, sociological, religious survey of America to date. And they said that according to their research, 12.3% of Americans believe that astrology impacts our life and our personalities, what we are. Is influenced by the position of planets in our birth sign. But there are at least 28% of the people who are not quite sure about whether astrology works. Nevertheless, they are open enough to consult their horoscopes to know or to try and determine their own lives, to understand themselves, who they are, and what they should be doing in life. So obviously, roughly 1 in 4 Americans takes astrology seriously, and that means that today we ought to respectfully try and understand their point of view. Why do they take astrology seriously? It's not some ancient belief out there in the third world. It's very much part of postmodern American life. Now, astrology came with a big bang in 1968 with the musical Hair, which became very popular because it had, for the first time in countries such as England, nudity and facets which were not acceptable to the censor board, which regulated drama or live performances in England. So it fought a big fight and won. The British law had to be changed. And the opening verse of this musical said, "When the moon is in the 7th house and Jupiter aligns with Mars, then peace will guide the planets and love will steer the stars. This is the dawning of the age of Aquarius." The age of Aquarius, Aquarius, Aquarius. Now, I didn't actually hear the song. I'm just reading it. But I was in India. We did hear about this musical of how astrology was making a big impact. And of course, the other name for the New Age movement, which was a powerful cultural phenomenon in the West, was the Age of Aquarius. So astrology was central to the New Age movement. We want to understand what exactly the Age of Aquarius means, but we need to realize that while in most pre-modern culture, astrology was part of divination, part of fortune telling, knowing your future, in the contemporary postmodern West, very often astrology is part of self-discovery, knowing who am I, what am I. So people would, if you ask the question, who are you, they would tell you their birth sign, that this is what I am, Aquarius or Pisces or whatever, Sagittarius. They'll just tell you that's how they define themselves. That's their self-understanding, who they are. And this is very important to know that it is not simply ancient art of divination, of fortune telling. It is in fact a means of self-understanding, defining ourselves. That's very significant, and I hope to use that as a key to explain a fundamental facet of the shift of Western society from modernism to postmodernism. But before we come to that, before we come to some details, let's take a few minutes to look at the big picture in this phenomenon. And I want to suggest that obviously a lot of people begin to follow a particular astrologer or particular school of astrology because of word-of-mouth publicity, personal anecdotes that such and so told me this, and it turned out to be true. So personal testimony, witness, anecdotes become very effective means of perpetuating faith in astrology and astrologers. But the underlying reason why astrology is becoming so important for so many people is really a major philosophical shift. So about this shift from modernism to postmodernism, we need to understand as a part of the big picture explanation, epistemology. That's a branch of philosophy that deals with theory of knowledge. How do we know? You imagine that there is a little boy way up in northern California, Canada, where it's always cold and snow. He is reading a book and he stops and he asks his mother, "Mother, what's a guava?" She says, "Why? It's a fruit that grows in India and also in Hawaii, etc." Oh, he says, "That makes sense. I was wondering why Ramu climbed a tree and ate guava. I thought guava was a lizard." Now the mother is puzzled. She says, "What is Ramu?" She assumes, a Ramu climbing tree and eating a fruit must be some sort of an animal. What's Ramu? I've never heard of him. Oh, he says, "This is this boy, Indian boy, in my story, the story that I'm reading." Okay. So what's a guava? The mother says it's a fruit. What's Ramu, or what's John, or what's Tim? The child says it's a boy. That's a very elementary lesson in epistemology. How do we know? It's theory of knowledge. How do we know? How do we know particulars? Particulars are things like guavas or Ramu or Mary or chair or whatever. These are all particulars. How do we know a particular? How do we know a guava or a mango or a banana? We know a particular by relating it to a universal. A banana makes sense if you can relate it to a larger category, a universal that we call fruit. So a banana is a fruit. Ramu is a boy. So Ramu is a particular, boy is a universal. But if the universal is finite, then it needs a bigger universal, a bigger category for us to understand what's a boy. Well, we say a boy is a young male human being. So you understand a boy by relating it to a larger category, a human being. A human being could be a female, could be a child, could be many things, but a young male human being. So you understand Ramu by relating it to a universal boy, but boy is a relative universal. It's universal with relationship to Ramu. In itself, it's finite, so it needs a bigger universal. So a boy is a human being. And what is a human being? Because human being is finite, we need to understand what is man? Who am I? What is a human being? Now you need to relate that to a still larger category. Modernism said that a human being is an animal. You are made in the image of monkeys. It does explain a lot of our biology, a lot of our physics, physique, but it doesn't really explain the core of our being, our distinctives. That we are the only culture creating species. We are creative, we create culture. What makes us creative creatures? The biblical answer, of course, was that you are creative because you are made in the image of a creator. You are a creature, but you are a special kind of a creature, a creative creature made in the image of a creator. But if you don't accept God and don't accept the fact that we are made in God's image, then you have no option in a modernist worldview framework to view yourself as an animal. Then what happens to human dignity? What is an animal? Well, an animal is a biological machine, because machine alone exists, a chemical, biological machine. What's a machine? Everything is a machine. An atom is a machine, solar system is a machine, galaxy is a machine, cosmos is a machine. That was mechanistic worldview of modernism. It didn't explain, because part of that mechanistic worldview was cause and effect. Every effect has a cause. So there can be no such thing as free will, moral responsibility, personality. What is the essence of creativity is freedom. Machines produce, we create. What's the difference? We create what we choose to create. We make a free decision that we aren't going to produce this today. A machine has to produce what it is programmed to produce. We create what we choose to create. That's the essence of ourselves, as we know ourselves as creative creatures. So that mechanistic worldview, which reduced us to machines without freedom, without dignity, without moral responsibility, it became dehumanizing view of ourselves, and therefore that modernistic worldview has been rejected. Now, if you reject the idea that man is made in the image of monkeys, then monkeys are animals and animals are machines, biological machines, etc., then postmodernism, the emerging worldview, needs a different understanding, a different universal. What is man? You can't relate man to animals. You've got to relate him to something else, someone else, larger categories. And that's where astrology comes in, that you are made in the image of your stars. Monkeys don't explain who you are, but your constellations, your planets explain who you are. If you want to understand yourself, you have to study astrology. Others would go into spirits, that the spirit world, you are a spirit, you are part of the spirit realm, so you need to be channeling, communicating with the spirits, and try to know the spirit world, and then you will know yourself, your higher self, etc. Others, because that becomes very subjective, prefer to move into the UFO scene, which I call saucers for the sake of alliteration. Stars and spirits and saucers. The Flying Saucers was a book which Carl Jung wrote. So who are we? We are actually younger brothers and sisters of ETs, who we are made in their image. We need relationship with them, communication from them to understand ourselves. And this is where also the whole sexual mysticism fits in, that in order to understand ourselves, we need to awaken the psychic energies within us, the male energy or the female energy, to get to know ourselves. And then finally, that what we talked about in the lecture on Hinduism, that man is a drop in the ocean, a drop of consciousness in the ocean of consciousness, which is Brahma, or God, the infinite. We are finite self, which is really part of an infinite self. And to know ourselves, we have to go within our consciousness and experience our infinity, etc. So the New Age movement is rejecting modernism and is trying to develop a new understanding of what a human being is, with reference to these various, what you would call in epistemology, various universals. And astrology is a significant possible answer in that direction. Now, so that's the big picture of what's happening in culture, what's happening in postmodernism. Postmodernism is struggling to find alternative universals, having rejected the idea that man is an animal or a machine, It is trying to find out alternative universals that will help us explain ourselves. Now, that's where the title of this lecture comes from, that astrology, let's make man in the image of his stars. Now, let's focus a little bit on astrology, still on the big picture before we get into some details. The big picture question is, what exactly is meant by the Age of Aquarius? The answer is that the Earth has 3 different motions. We know that it is rotating on its axis once in 24 hours, and from that we get our 24-hour day. It is also revolving around the sun once in 365 days, and that's how we get our year. But there is a third motion that on its axis, it's moving, it's wobbling, which is a motion called precession. And that motion is also rhythmical. It takes about 25,800 years for that motion to go take one complete circle. One result of that motion called precession is that the position of the Earth in relationship to these constellations, the 12 constellations that form the zodiac, as the reference point. You know, there are billions of stars, a few 100,000, a million that we can see, and there is some of those have been divided in these constellations, and that happened a few hundred years before Christ in Babylon. That forms sort of a reference point, that if you want to know where exactly is a planet, how do you describe where is a planet? You describe that with reference to the constellations that are beyond the planets, so that these 12 constellations, some would say 10, some would say 24 constellations, is simply an astronomical or scientific reference point to help us talk about the position of different planets at different times, since planets are moving. So what happens with the Age of Aquarius is simply that, on the vernal equinox around the 21st of March, the sun is directly overhead on the equator, and if you are looking at the sun from this Earth, you would see it at the edge of the constellation of Pisces. It is moving away from Pisces now, entering into Aquarius, and it will be there for around 2,000 years. Now, so a new age of Aquarius is coming. That's a result of this motion of precession. What we're being told is that this ushers in a whole new age, where the sociological impact of this planetary movement or this motion of the Earth will be that we will move from the age of patriarchy into matriarchy, the age of feminism, where the aggression and violence will be replaced by love and tenderness and kindness and peace. The wars will cease. So this became a part of the metaphysics of the anti-Vietnam, anti-war movement, which continues to this day. It did bring the Vietnam War to an end, but it also turned every home into a domestic battlefield, with a lot of wars happening in courtrooms, divorce battles, etc., etc. But that was understood that we have not yet quite entered the age of peace, but we are moving in that direction. At least the oppression of the husbands and the oppression of the male is coming to an end. Now, that all may be true. The question is that the fact of the motion of precession and the fact that now the age of Aquarius is beginning, where do you get the clues from? That what does this astronomical fact mean in psychological, sociological terms? How do you interpret that? How do you find that, determine that this is the meaning, this is the sociological or moral meaning of these astronomical facts? Because the facts themselves, stars and planets, they don't give you any clue of determining, of interpreting. The implication is, the question then is, how do the stars influence us, or how do we know what exactly the influence of the stars will be if you're having a child through cesarean section, whether to have the birth today or tomorrow or next week? Should the doctors make the decision, or should the astrologers make the decision, which would be the best deal for the child, the best sign under which to be born? And how does an astronomer or astrologer know which particular sign would be better for the child's personality, future, career, success, or failure, etc.? The horoscope is indeed a scientific chart. It's a mathematical chart which an astronomer who doesn't believe in astrology would draw exactly the same horoscope as an astrologer will draw. A computer would draw exactly the same horoscope as an intelligent astrologer will draw. So the natal chart itself is a scientific mathematical chart, but how you interpret it, how you apply it, is the question. Now, there are a lot of people who would argue that the astrological interpretations are in fact just common sense, cold reading. If they turn out to be true, usually they are vague generalities which can be applied to many different people, many different situations. Sometimes, if they are specific and turn out to be true, they are common sense, cold reading. That's the position that Dan Korem, for example, takes in his book Powers, Psychic and Supernatural, a very good book published by InterVarsity Press. He is a Jew, magician turned scholar. But many of the astrologers themselves, in fact, claim that no, this is not simply common sense reading. Astrology is a science. There is a science, means there is a cause and effect relationship between the movement of the planets and the personality and future and day-to-day life of a child. There is science, the mechanistic science, as it grew in the 16th, 17th centuries, took the law of cause and effect as a scientific law, as a given law, that every effect has to have a cause, and if we know the effect, we should be able to say what the cause is, and if we know the cause, we should be able to predict what the effect will be, that if you have 2 atoms of oxygen or hydrogen and 1 atom of oxygen, the result will be water H2O. The cause would have the same effect, doesn't matter where the experiment is being done, under what circumstances, etc. In any part of the universe, there is cause and effect. This is a law of the mechanistic universe. Now, this idea that the astrology is a science, and we will see that many serious believers in astrology propose that it's not a science, but it's true. And they give alternative explanations that how it could be true without being science, and we are going to look at that in a moment. But let's dwell just for a little while on this belief that astrology is a proper science of cause and effect. The motion of the planets actually has these particular effects on each individual human beings. The first prima facie evidence that there is a cause and effect relationship between the motions of the planets or heavenly bodies and human beings is that in the sun and moon in fact do govern the day and the night. They do govern life on this planet. The sun determines when we will get up, when we will go to sleep. Well, at least most of the nature, most animals, most birds, most plants, some plants wake up when the sun goes to sleep. Some plants wake up when the sun rises, and they go to sleep with the sun. Same with animals. Some animals may in fact be opposite, but nevertheless, the behavior of the natural world is governed by the sun and the moon. The sun and moon determine whether we are going to wear shorts or whether we are going to wear woolen, when we will plant and when we will water and when we will harvest, which determines when we will take holidays in most agricultural societies, and it determines which would be a good time to get married, etc. These facts of life are in fact governed by the heavenly bodies. A deeper scientific fact that we discussed in the lecture on Hinduism is that subatomic physics or quantum mechanics has demonstrated that two electrons, if they are part of one system, remain connected even when they are separated. They remain connected mysteriously over long distances. So if one is moving this way and the other is moving in the opposite direction, if this changes its direction, this will automatically change its direction. We don't know how they are connected, but we do know that they are connected. So this interconnectedness of electrons has led to a very popular understanding of interconnectedness of everything. If you weren't here on the lecture on Hinduism, you might want to listen to that lecture to understand that fact. Now that fact is extrapolated that everything in the universe is interconnected, and because our material bodies, the matter that forms our bodies, was forged in the heat of the stars, or at least one star which formed our solar system and our Earth, therefore our bodies are in fact connected to a star. Assuming there was one star which blew up and became part of these planets, and the present star, the father of the present star, and all the planets, if they all came out of one original star, then our bodies are in fact forged with the same material. So electronically we are connected. In terms of electrons, we are connected with these planets, and therefore it's reasonable to assume that their movement in fact has influence on our body. Now, we can see in average life, I mean, a person can be completely illiterate and see that yes, in fact, sun and moon are connected with our daily lives, and they do regulate our earth. And in fact, that's what Genesis 1:14-18 tells us, that God created sun and moon to govern the day and the night. So they are governors, they are rulers, and they are created as signs, which implies that we ought to be reading those signs. There's no point having signs that nobody reads, nobody understands. But the influence of the planets is rather hard to observe in day-to-day life. But a few years ago, John H. Nelson, who was working for the Radio Corporation of America, he predicted with 93% accuracy on which days the radio reception will be good and on which day radio receptions will be bad. His predictions were astounding. What he had discovered was that radio reception is good when two or more planets relate to the sun at 60 or 120 degrees. And radio reception is bad when these two or more planets are related to the sun at 0 or 90 or 180 degrees. So the movement of the planets, and later it was discovered that somehow this motion of the planets creates planetary magnetic storms which affect radio signals. So if they affect radio signal, they might have more effects which normally we are not aware of. And this sort of gives the possibility to the hypothesis that astrology might in fact be a proper science, which we haven't brought the rigor of scientific method to a study of astrology, but we ought to, because the planets, if they affect magnetic storms that affect the radio signals, they might in fact have other kinds of effects on our behavior and life and body. Now, Michele Gore, and I can never pronounce this French scholar's name correctly, he is very well known. He is the father of the contemporary interest, scholarly interest in astrology. His book, Cosmic Clock and Astrology in Science, gives a number of facts of how life on this planet is influenced by the motion of the heavenly bodies. To take just one example for illustration, that he found out that there is a particular shellfish which lays eggs only on full moons between January and July. Now, there is no way a fish could calculate when the full moon would be in advance and plan to lay eggs on that day. There is obviously there is a body clock in that fish which is passed on genetically from generation to generation, which helps this fish to lay eggs only on full moons during particular months. So he collects just a number of facts such as these, that the cumulative impact of those facts is that the planets they do govern the day and the night and the life on this planet in ways that we have not yet adequately studied. Now, Michele, let's just call him by his first name, he didn't find much evidence for a particular birth signs being more conducive to success in different careers, that if you were born under this sign, you would be successful star in Hollywood, a successful writer in Hollywood, etc. He didn't find that correlation, but he did find influence of some planets on some, that is statistical influence of some planets on some inclinations that a person born under this sign tends to prefer this kind of a job. Whether he will succeed or not isn't demonstrated according to his studies. Now, obviously, it was a very preliminary study. It hasn't been confirmed independently to the best of my knowledge. And even if the facts themselves are confirmed by other studies, we have no way of interpreting those facts at this moment, because facts by themselves don't necessarily give you clues to understanding them. But there are others who are more committed to astrology, J. West and Tunder, that I've referred to their book, Case for Astrology, which in fact tries to marshal statistical evidence that we've looked at so many cases of successful musicians, or painters, or mathematicians, or physicians, or artists, etc. And this birth sign tends to move people in this direction and that direction and that direction. And they say that the evidence is there for anyone who is honest enough to look at it. So the argument of all the impact of all of these facts is that there is a growing body of people who believe that astrology is proper science. It hasn't received the kind of scientific attention it ought to, and therefore it's not yet part of our courses in science faculties in universities, but given the effort and the money and the research, we might well one day begin to treat astrology as science, and then we will remove some of the superstitions and hocus pocus that has got mixed up with it, which it has. They will be the first to admit, and then it will become a more reliable and purified science. Well, obviously, there are a lot of problems with astrologers, and thoughtful astrologers themselves see with this assertion. I have already mentioned one problem, that while horoscope is a mathematical scientific chart, the rules for interpreting that are completely arbitrary. So how do you know that this day is good for you to travel if you are a Pisces, but not good for you to travel if you are an Aquarian? How do you know that? Where do you get that rule for interpretation from? That this particular person is more prone to accident on this day than that, a person born in a different sign. The best explanations that believers who claim that astrology is a science, their best interpretation is that our sages, ancient sages in the past in Babylon or India or China, they had somehow decoded those rules. Their children forgot how they found out the rules to interpret astrology. But the fact that we don't remember how our ancient seers discovered those rules doesn't necessarily mean that rules themselves are false, because they work. Now, some people go beyond that and say, in fact, our ancestors several 100,000 years ago came from outer space in UFO. And they came from more advanced civilizations in other galaxies, and they had knowledge of interpreting natal charts and horoscopes. They had brought that knowledge from us, but since that knowledge was obtained by civilizations millions of years ahead of us, we obviously don't know how they knew, but they knew. And we have that knowledge available to us. Now, that may be so, but obviously now we're not talking science, we are talking faith. This is what believers in astrology believe. They have no way of proving it, they have no way of demonstrating it. So we're not really talking science, we're talking faith. It's their faith. The problem obviously goes much beyond that. And that is that astrology exploits the scientific fact of interconnectedness of electrons for its purposes. It doesn't actually take that seriously. For example, if everything is interconnected in this universe, then not only the moon should have an influence on me, but if I'm born here in California, then the ocean should have an impact, because I'm also connected to the ocean. I'm also connected to the underground minerals. They ought to have an impact. So how can I study myself without knowing the impact of the ocean, or the impact of the tree under which I was born, or the building material that was used in the hospital where I was born? But then obviously the movement of birth is an artificial movement, because if it is C-section, it could be changed. So maybe the movement of conception should be the movement where the position of stars would shape me. But then more than that, to be a little more serious, when we began the lecture series here, we had an Indian gentleman who was doing PhD in the university, comes from a Hindu family, became a Christian just 3 months ago, went back to his home. Yesterday I had a terrible email from him that his older brother died in an accident. Now, was it his brother's chart, if everything is interconnected, then obviously his horoscope, his brother's horoscope, is one thing. Maybe the problem was not with his brother's horoscope, but with the car's horoscope, because the car is also connected to the stars and the planets. In India now, you do have to get horoscopes of your car, and then you obviously have a problem. When exactly is a car born? Is it born the day it comes out of the factory, or the day it is licensed, registered, and you very often don't know on which particular day the car was actually born. So how do you make a horoscope for your car? It's obviously you have to make horoscopes for your dogs and your cats, because everything is interconnected, and everything is influenced by the same facts, right? So once you are looking only at a few arbitrarily selected aspects, because you're not looking at most of the stars and most of the constellations and most of the galaxies, you're only looking at some arbitrarily selected constellations. And these constellations are very different in Chinese astrology, in Indian astrology, in Western astrology. Even planets are different. Western astrology deals with 7 planets, including sun and moon. Indian astrology deals with 9 planets. 7 are the same as the Western, but then 2 nodes of moon that we call Rahul and Ketu are part of the 9 planets. The New Age astrology is trying to incorporate the influence of the new planets that were discovered, including Pluto. When I was studying the New Age movement, they were trying to incorporate the impact of Pluto as a planet, but Pluto ceased being a planet. The scientists decided that Pluto is not a planet. Leaving that aside, I don't mean to be sarcastic, but just illustrating that this is arbitrary. If you take the fact of interconnectedness seriously, then you have got to study impact of everything in order to understand yourself, which simply is impossible. Simply is not possible. Now, the fact that the systems of astrology, Western, Indian, Chinese, Egyptian, etc., they all work equally well or unwell. You can get great stories from Western astrologers and great anecdotal stories from Indian astrologers. If completely different systems of astrology have similar rate of success, then obviously there is some other principle at work. Let me illustrate this. You have fever, you go to an MD, you get an injection, your fever goes, and the doctor explains to you that this fever is caused by that factor, and this medicine takes care of that problem, therefore your fever is gone. You believe it, it's all black and white. Every time that particular cause has resulted in fever, this medicine will take care of that depending on the size of the body and age, etc., the right dosage. It is pretty well standardized medicine. Now, supposing you are in India and the refrigeration doesn't work, the hospital doesn't actually have that particular medicine, but the doctor knows that you don't know that he doesn't have the medicine. So he just gives you a distilled water injection. You believe that it's the same medicine because he's charging you exactly the same amount of money. And your fever also disappears at the same speed. If distilled water has cured you, now you are in a tribal village where there isn't even an injection, but a magician has a magic stone. And he says, if you put this magic stone under your pillow and sleep, your fever will disappear, and it does. Or there is some herb. If completely different things have the same effect, then maybe none of those things, or maybe only one of those things, works mechanically as cause and effect. The other things may be working as placebo, that it's your faith which is healing you. Your faith, your expectation is triggering off production of certain chemicals in your brain that have therapeutic powers. So what is healing is your faith, your expectation, your belief, which triggers production of certain chemicals in your brain which heal. Magic stone doesn't heal, herbs don't heal, the distilled water doesn't heal, your faith heals. So there's some other factor is success may be there. The astrologer may have actually told you what you think is a spectacular piece of information which actually works, but it may have nothing to do with his interpretation of the horoscope. He might as well be interpreting tea leaves and tell you with same kind of success. So the point is that at this moment, serious, thoughtful believers in astrology don't actually believe that astrology is a science, for these reasons and many more reasons that you will find in that little booklet, which we do not need to spend more time on this right now. The serious advocates of astrology don't promote it as science, they promote it as metascience. It's not unscientific, it is true, but it's not science. It's metascience. Now, what's metascience? Let's begin with Paul Kammerer's experimental biologist in Vienna. He argued in 1919 that causation, law of cause and effect, may not be an absolute scientific law that explains everything in this universe. In other words, the universe, physical universe, may not be a mechanistic universe. There may be more to it than that. For 20 years, he kept a logbook of coincidences in his life. Let me illustrate with my own example. I'm going to Bombay after 5 years, and since I'm going there, I want to see a particular person who lives there. It's a huge city, millions and millions of people, 30 million people. I'm there only for half an hour, changing trains. I want to see him, and I pray. I don't have his phone number, I don't have address. I pray, I step out of the train, I see him walking in front of me. Now, once that happening could be pure chance, coincidence. If that sort of thing happens 10 times, then something more is at work than coincidence. Now, I believe it's prayer, but that's my belief. Prayer may have nothing to do. It may be telepathy or some other things that are at work. As a scientist, if you're investigating what exactly is going on, if these kinds of coincidences are happening and again, you have to have an explanation. You don't have to accept my explanation that there is a God who answers prayers, who moves things and people, but you still have to respond to the fact. So he kept a logbook for 20 years, and then he published 100 personal coincidences that impressed Einstein, and Einstein said that this is not an absurd statement, this is serious, and his own explanation was that causation, cause and effect, may not be the full explanation for material universe. There may be a law of seriality, as he called it. In other words, things may be related to each other, not cause and effect, but meaningful, in space and time, there are occurrences and recurrences that are related to each other meaningfully, but not causally. Let me explain the philosophical problem, why, to help you understand this point and the next 2 points, and it's very important to understand why modernism is collapsed, why the scientific materialistic worldview of the 19th and 20th century has collapsed, and the New Age and postmodern worldview is emerging. It is still vague, still fuzzy, but it is emerging. If every effect has to have a cause, mechanical, physical cause, then the question is, what caused this universe? Christians, Jews, Muslims would say that God created the universe. God is the cause. So if every effect has to have a cause, who caused God? Who created God is a legitimate question. The only problem with that question is that within Judeo-Christian worldview, God is outside the world, the mechanistic world of cause and effect. Cause and effect are part of this universe, which is space-time continuum, 4-dimension of Einstein. God is before time, so cause and effect apply to this universe, they don't apply to God. Now you say, I'm not going to believe it. So what Judeo-Christian worldview is saying is that the principle that every effect has to have a cause is part of the mechanistic universe. It doesn't apply outside this universe, because outside this universe, the phenomenon outside of this universe isn't regulated by the laws of this universe. You say, I don't believe that, I'm not going to accept that a God exists. Okay, if you are going to be a modernist and insist that every effect has to have a cause, then your universe has to have a cause. What caused it? Where did the universe come from? If you reject God, you have to believe that either universe is eternal, but now you know, since the Big Bang, you know that universe is not eternal. The best date as of today is 14.7 billion years ago, or 13.7 billion years ago, Big Bang happened, universe came into existence. What caused the universe? If you believe in the Big Bang theory, you say that we don't know and we can't ask that question because the laws of physics come in existence at the point of Big Bang. The laws of physics, the law of cause and effect, doesn't exist before Big Bang. So, in other words, even if you are a modernist, beyond a point, you have to reject that cause and effect is not an absolute law. So what are the other laws? This is where these other alternatives come in. Law of seriality was one proposal, but what really helped astrology take off as an intellectually respectable idea was Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli, who was a Nobel laureate in physics. They wrote an essay in 1952 called Synchronicity, an acausal connecting principle. And they're basically saying the same thing as Paul Kemmerer was saying, that causation may not be the only law governing our physical universe. What is synchronicity? We don't know. We can't even think about it. Carl Jung is saying it's beyond thought, but it has to be there because we do know that there are a lot of things in this universe that do not have causation in the sense of modern science of physics and chemistry. One such thing is obviously radioactive decay. Radioactive decay, we do not know what causes it. We cannot know what causes it. We will never know what causes it. It is an uncaused phenomenon. So radioactive decay becomes a point of illustration that there are things happening in this universe that are not governed by cause and effect. So they happen. And he said telepathy, clairvoyance, other paranormal phenomenon, including astrology. Now, Carl Jung advocated astrology, But he didn't say that synchronicity proves astrology or astrology proves synchronicity. He said, in fact, if astrology had sufficient body of thoroughly tested results, then astrology could be a proof of synchronicity. But we have to assume some such law of causation. But neither the law of seriality nor synchronicity actually explain anything, as Jung is saying that these are not even thinkable concepts because they are outside thought, except that we've got to assume them to be there. But many of the New Age writers propose a third alternative, which is vibrational connections. The connection between our planets and us is vibrational. The whole universe is vibrating. It's energy. Now, Big Bang vibration is there, although we can't hear it. But now we have some devices to hear it. These planets and stars are also vibrating. We are also vibrating, and there is vibrational connection. And maybe the zodiac sign, birth sign, is the lens through which the cosmic energies are focused into our body, and they influence and shape us. Now, this has become a quasi-scientific theory behind contemporary interest in astrology. But then they go on to, in fact, argue that these planets are not simply objective entities, heavenly bodies. The planets really are subpersonalities within us. This has become a very important part of New Age astrology. New Age astrology, as I said, is not simply a method of knowing our future. It is also becoming increasingly a healing technique, a therapeutic technique. And the reason they argue or how they are building that case for astrological healing, so if you go to any New Age festival, you will find a lot of astrological healing booths where there will be psychotherapy or psychosynthesis. One person, an important person, is Tracy Marks, who wrote Astrology of Self-Discovery. Now, she says an important principle of depth astrology is that planets are actually personalities within us, not merely parts of qualities of ourselves, but entities in their own rights, with lives of their own. In psychosynthesis, which is her technique of astrological healing, she says in psychosynthesis, we do directed fantasies and dialogues with subpersonalities within us, which are similar to our planetary selves. Now, a very simple way of understanding this is that what she's saying is planets are spirits, deities that are within us, demigods. And in fact, that is how most of the ancient world looked at astrologies. Planets were gods. Therefore, you had to appease them. You have to offer sacrifices. Otherwise, they create obstacles. Once you appease them, then you can go on your way and do your business. Now, this is something which Dr. Anthony Stone, who is a professor of mathematics, became a Sanskrit scholar, is the world's greatest authority on Hindu astrology. He came to conclude after extensive study of Hindu astrology that in fact astrology is spirituality or spiritism, spiritualism, where the astrologer, when astrology works, it works because the astrologer is in fact a medium of spirits speaking through him and guiding you, like the seers guiding you. Now, I tend to agree with that because of one of the more very dramatic experience that I had myself. I was participating in an election, and one of the highly respected public figures, who was also a professor of mathematics and astrologer, My whole group insisted that I must go and see him. I don't believe in this business, but I must go and see him, because if he blesses me, then a lot of people will take me seriously. And he happened to have been from the same people group that I was seeking to represent. So I decided to go and see him. He's a public figure, highly respected. I should make friends with him. I went there, and he was very pleased, and he said to me that you will register your papers, file your papers at 11:23. I forget the exact time, but 11:23 a.m., some such thing. He gave me a very precise moment. Now, I made up my mind that I'm going to defy him, and I'm going to file my papers an hour before. So I made every effort to file my papers before the time that he had given. But there were so many obstacles that came up that by the time I filed, it was precisely the moment he had said I would file my papers. So even by looking at him, when I was with him for a few minutes, I knew that there was something more than human here. So a number of astrologers are in fact saying that astrology is part of divination, part of spiritism. And very often when astrologers are successful, the explanation may really be spiritistic. Well, this explains why astrology in cultures such as India became very oppressive and corruptive influences. In the 19th century, the first lower caste social reformer in India was Mahatma Jyotirao Phule. He wrote a lot of books against slavery in India, and he was really inspired by American Revolution, which he saw as a whole culture fighting against slavery, and he longed for that the lower caste in India might be set free from the untouchability and slavery in India. Now, one of his specific attacks was on astrology, that Indians had been enslaved through astrology. The gods of astrology, the planets, were deities, and they used their powers to harass people. Therefore, you always had to appease them. And in appeasing them, obviously, you were making offerings of money and food and liquor and alcohol and this and that to the astrologers, who were invariably Brahmins, or the priests. So it was part of priestcraft, which was oppressive and exploitative, and it was in the interest of these priests to terrify people that Saturn is inauspicious to you, or Mars is inauspicious to you tomorrow, and you can't do business, and you can't get married now, etc., unless you offer proper appeasements. This is a case which was talked about extensively in Western media, was when the young prince in Nepal a few years ago killed his father and mother and brothers and uncle, etc., and himself, 7-8 people he killed. The reason was he wanted to marry a girl, and the royal astrologers said that if he marries this girl before he is 35, or if he gets married before he is 35, his father will die. Now, parents didn't want him to marry this girl, so astrologers were very helpful in predicting that if he married before he was 35, his father will die. Now, obviously, for his father's life's sake, he can't get married until he's 35, and they were hoping that by this time the girl will die, so he would never marry her. So he knew that this is all hoax. The royal astrologers are really saying what his parents want him to say. So he decided to shoot this family, and that's how the uncle became the king, and then Nepal got into a terrible mess, which hopefully you've been reading for the last few years. This kind of oppression, deception, fear, cultivation of fear, paralyzing people, that you cannot make decisions, you cannot run your own life unless you have appeased these astrological deities, became part of our culture, against which Mahatma Jyotirao Phule led a whole social reform movement. This was the sort of situation against which Moses was reacting when Moses prohibited astrology and medium and spirits and banned them. And in fact, Moses prescribed capital punishment for fortune tellers. Here he is, Moses, risking his life to liberate the Hebrews from slavery of Egypt, bring them into freedom. But that freedom will amount to nothing if in the promised land, Hebrew astrologers themselves begin to enslave people by terrifying them in the name of the planets that this god is inauspicious to you today and that god is inauspicious for you tomorrow, and you cannot travel and you cannot make business deal, or you cannot get married and you cannot do this unless you do this, that, and the other, etc. This is slavery. It's not good enough for you to be liberated from a pharaoh only to be enslaved by fellow Hebrews. God wants you to be free. God wants you to be related to Him as your Father. This is what He is your guide. He is taking you through difficult situations. But He wants to be your God. He wants you to be His people, not to be afraid of giants, not to be afraid of difficulties, but to overcome, to live by faith. Faith should mean freedom, not paralysis, not fear, but fearlessness. That's what Moses is saying. So this is what becomes a theme in the Old Testament. Jeremiah 10, for example, Jeremiah is saying, don't be afraid of the signs and the stars as the other nations are afraid of them and paralyzed by them. You are to live by faith. Faith has to mean freedom and power and overcoming, conquering, not being paralyzed into fatalism and inaction. And that becomes part of the New Testament, that if the Son shall make you free, because what the Son is going to do is make you a child of God. So your life is not regulated by these spirits and these deities, but your life is governed by God. Like David, you read Psalm 23. David is going through very deep tunnels. He says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Why? Because you're with me. I walk with you. You're with me. Your staff, your rod, they comfort me. And that's the kind of dynamic relationship God wants you to have with you. That's the kind of relationship in which Jesus is inviting you to become God's child. And therefore, He wants you to be freed from these paralyzing beliefs. So, how astrology became the means not only of creating this culture of fear and paralysis and slavery, but also corruption, hit me a few years ago. We had in Andhra Pradesh a film actor, N.T. Ramarao, who always played the role of gods. We have lots of gods, and in one film he will play one god, in another film he will play another god, and that made him very popular. Finally, he decided to become a politician and ran for chief ministership in his party. He became the chief minister, and he was very arrogant because he was God. His party had won on his strength, so everybody had to serve him. So he came to America for some medical treatment, and his party revolted against him. He lost his chief ministership. He was very angry. The coalition fell apart. 6 months later, there was fresh election. So he won the second election also. He campaigned against his own party men who had deserted him, and people voted for him. They punished the rebels, and he came back to chief ministership. And then he brought all his state MPs, members of parliament, we call them MLAs, together one night in a closed room, took a basin of water, washed his feet, and had all of them drink that water as an oath of loyalty to him, that we are going to be loyal to him. But then once he had secured their loyalty, he became very oppressive and dictatorial and authoritarian again. So there was a second revolt. His own son-in-law revolted against him, took over power from him. He had a heart attack and was deposed. Now, just before this happened, one fine day he had stopped going to his office, his official secretariat, and he stopped going there because his astrologers told him that your entrance is from the north side and your north star is not auspicious. You have to have an exit from the east side. That's where you need to enter from. So 9 residential houses had to be demolished. A new entrance had to be built before he would go to office. And then this happened, that his son-in-law revolted and he lost his throne again. Now, I was speaking in that city a few months later. So, I asked people, that the audience, I was sort of joking with them, that here was this really nice chap. He had banned alcohol from the state. He was selling rice 2 rupees a kilo, a few cents a kilo. He was giving saris to poor women when they would get married. The voters loved him. They voted for him. Why were gods inauspicious to him simply because he is entering his office building from the wrong side? Why is it that today Saturn is not pleased with you and tomorrow Mars is inauspicious to you? Why do gods behave this way, that if you don't appease them, they create troubles for you? Well, they don't have to have any reason to be upset with you. This is their nature. Gods use their powers to create obstacles for you unless you appease them, unless you offer sacrifices to them. So it's the nature of gods, astrological gods, to use their powers to create obstacles. Because gods are venals, they use their power to extract appeasement, extract bribes from you. Every Indian becomes godly. Every Nepali becomes godly, meaning godlike, like their gods. Whatever power any Indian has, he uses that power not to serve, but to create troubles for you. If you don't bribe me, I may be a simple clerk. I may in fact be a sweeper who is cleaning the sewage in front of your house. And if you don't bribe me, I'll make your life miserable. Not clean your streets, not clean your sewage. So everyone begins to use his power to create problems for others unless you appease me. And this became the chief reason for corruption in India. And Neeraj Chaudhary, one of our best writers in the 20th century, he wrote a book called The Autobiography of an Unknown Indian. And he argued that India was as corrupt as it is mainly because our gods are venal, corrupt, constantly using their power to create obstacles. And I began to realize that India isn't going to be changed, it's not going to be reformed, unless our gods are replaced by a God who uses his power to bless, to heal, who doesn't take sacrifices from you, but sacrifices himself so that you might have life and that you might have it more abundantly. Well, let's move towards conclusion. Obviously, this is a very brief summary of the booklet that you have in front of you. Let's begin to move towards a conclusion. The heart of the issue, if you are thinking about astrology, the most important question about astrology is this: should our stars rule over us? Are we made in the image of the stars? Or are we made in the image of God who created the stars? Should our times rule over us, or should we be ruling over our times? I've already discussed earlier that sun, moon, stars obviously do govern the day and the night and various physical phenomena. The Bible is very clear in Genesis 1:14-19 that he created sun and moon to govern the day and the night. So their authority is given. But Genesis 1 goes on to say in 26, 27, 28, 29, and God said, let's make man in our image. He made man in his own image, male and female, blessed them, said, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, and establish your rule over this earth. So should sun and moon govern us, or should they assist us in establishing our dominion over this earth? This is the key issue. Now, obviously, the sun and the moon decide when we are going to get up and when we are going to go to bed, but they don't really have to rule over us. We say to the sun that, look, you can rule over the dogs and the cats and the birds. You can tell them when they should go to sleep, but we've got work to do. So whether it's going to be light or darkness in our rooms, in our offices, in our cars, in our church, in our halls, we will decide, not you. Right? We will lengthen the day artificially. You can decide what the temperature will be over this planet, but you can't decide what I'm going to wear in my office or in my home. Because I can turn thermostat up or down, I will decide what the temperature will be in my house. Why? Because you don't rule over me. I'm created to govern. Now, not only sun, moon, stars are created to rule, they are created as markers. God created them to be signs. And as I said, it doesn't make any sense to have signs which nobody understands, nobody reads. So stars ought to be studied. But that study should not be astrology, but astronomy. What's the difference? The culture of astrology is a culture where our times rule over us. They decide whether this is a good day to do business, to enter into a contract, to fall in love, to get married, etc., or this is a bad day. Our times should not be ruling over us. We should be ruling over our time. Sun, moon, stars, they are signs in the sense that they help us to divide this universe of space and time into manageable parts. How do we know what is east, what is west, what is north, what is south? How do we know? Think before GPS system and other system. How did the sailors, Columbus and others, come to America or go to India and colonized America and colonize India? In the ocean, there were no signs that America is left or right. They had to read the stars, right? That was the sign system. So the monotony of this humongous space and time is divided into calendars and clocks and geography, maps, through this reference system which is given to us in the universe. So we ought to be studying them. We know the calendar, we create calendars to establish our dominion. England, a tiny island, was able to colonize a big subcontinent such as India because of the stars. They were able to know how to go to India and colonize. We didn't know how to go to England because we couldn't read the stars that way. So, culture of astronomy was born when culture of astrology was rejected, that we aren't going to let our stars rule over them, but we're going to study them to establish our dominion over this earth. This raises the point, who is greater, time or man? Now, you're born today, you die tomorrow, time continues. Is time greater? No. If you have immortal soul, You are greater than time. Adam and Eve were not created to die. They were created to live forever. Death came as a result of sin. But if Jesus actually died and rose again, and if he has conquered death, and if he is offering eternal life to us, we then once again become greater than time. Time shall be no more. We will be there in a kingdom which is an everlasting kingdom, a kingdom which is beyond this cosmos of physical world of time and space. So, sometimes astrologers can be a means of comfort. You're going through a dark phase in your life, a dark tunnel. To know the end can sustain you. But a stronger person, what would you have? Would you rather know the end, or would you rather have, and you're going through a really big jungle or forest full of wild animals, would you rather know the end, or would you rather have a guide who knows the end and who is strong enough to see you through with you? You want to have a shepherd with you who can lead the sheep, not just tell the sheep, where to turn and when to rest and when to eat, and you are on your own. Go into this jungle in the midst of wild wolves. Now, that's what true spirituality is. Not knowing relationship with stars, but having a relationship with the God who created the stars and wants to become our Father, wants to become our shepherd, wants to become our Lord and guide, who guides us through. So, the difference between the culture of astrology and the culture of astronomy is astrology is slavery, is fearfulness, is paralysis, leads to fatalism, leads to corruption, leads to destruction. But studying the stars and the planets and the constellations to establish our dominion over this earth as God's children, that this is his earth, we are going to manage this earth as his children for his glory, empowers us. We are walking with him. That's true liberty.